Hi there, my name is Edward McLeod-Jones and I'm currently the Bot and Web Engineering Lead for Client Technology at NatWest Markets. Today I want to share a video with you that I've made using Microsoft Bot Framework Composer, which is a new tool. It was announced last year at Microsoft Ignite, and they've released it just recently at Microsoft Build. It's a open source visual authoring canvas for developers that allows you to quickly put together bots using a sort of drag and drop style interface, and it's a very quick and easy way to get started with building simple bots, and it's all based off of their larger bot framework SDK. So I'm going to cover how to build a few simple bots using that, and then show how they can work inside of Symphony, and also at the end show how the exact same bot will work in the same way inside of Microsoft Teams as well. So let's get started. So the Microsoft Bot Framework Composer website is linked in the show notes, so you can go there to find out how to download it. It's available as a desktop application, or you can also host it as a website. It's also very extensible, so you can sort of customize it to your own needs and add sort of almost any part of it that you see you can extend and use to create your own things. So this is what it looks like once it's installed and you open it up. You get a few example options to get you started, but we're just going to start with a clean template and start from scratch. We're going to call it Composer Bot because it's an example of using Composer, and we're just going to save that into a folder and get started. So it's a blank canvas to start off with. It adds a simple greeting to start off with. So what we're going to do is set up our recognizer types. So it has a few options built in for recognizing the input that comes into the chatbot. So you can sort of roll your own. If you choose none, you can parse the text however you want and take whatever actions you want. It also includes Lewis options, which is Microsoft's NLP engine, language understanding service. And then finally it's got a simple regular expression based parser built in, so we're just going to use that to make it quick to get going with. So we choose a regular expression, and the default result is saved into dialog.result property. So to start off with, we're going to add a new trigger, so when the intent is recognized based off of the regular expression parsing the text, we're going to have an action take place in our bot, and so we're going to call that echo trigger, and the input pattern it's going to look for is just the text echo. So this is our trigger. So to start off with, we're going to click on the plus button to add a new action that we want to take place, and in this case we're just going to send a response back. So over on the right hand pane you get some options for what to do based on the activity that you've selected in the left hand pane. So this sort of showcases Microsoft's language generation abilities, which is the ability to have multiple responses that are picked at random. So it's a good way to give your bot a bit of personality. In this case we're just going to send a simple reply back, and it's going to use the turn, which is this current action that's taken place with the bot, and the activity is a message with a bunch of properties, and then the text is what we've parsed out of the text that has been sent to the bot in its raw state. So to start off with, we load the bot up, and it'll start it, and it'll give us the option to test it in the emulator. So the emulator is the Microsoft Bot Framework emulator, which is a pretty useful tool. I'm just going to allow access to our through the firewall. And so it's this is the message. We haven't changed that yet. We could do if we wanted to, just to when the bot recognizes a new user has started to interact with the bot, it'll send that message through. So if we type echo, it's going to recognize that trigger, and it's just going to reply back with the text that we sent in, which in this case is always just going to be echo. So just to show you an example of how the language generation works, if we put in some extra options there, that'll, like I say, pick at random each turn one of those responses and send that back. So you can restart the bot and then go test that back in the emulator, and again type in echo a few more times and see what it comes back with. So this time, instead of you said, it's come back with echoing back. This time it's come back with you said again, and then the last option is there an echo in here. So that just should give you a quick overview of a very basic bot, just echoing back whatever input it receives based off of a trigger that it recognizes. So pretty quick and simple. Just to show you how that looks inside of Symphony, we're going to run up our Symphony project. So what we've done to get that working is put some custom middleware inside of the bot framework project that the bot composer tool generates. So there's not an option to tell it to generate the bot framework code, which you can then go and extend. So we've put some custom middleware in there, so it can work with Symphony, and you can see there that it's working the same as it did inside of the emulator, but this time it's actually working directly with Symphony. So the next thing we're going to do is try something a bit different, where we take some input and then take an action based on that to go and fetch an HTTP resource. So I'm going to go back in and create a new trigger, and this time we're going to call this one Chuck trigger, because it's going to go and fetch a Chuck Norris fact. And the input, it's going to look for us just Chuck. So again, we're going to, this is inside the trigger, whereas before we would just send a response directly from within the trigger. In this case, we're going to create a new dialog instead and nest all of our sort of bot logic inside of that. And the reason being that at the end we're going to offer the user the ability to repeat the dialog, in which case it'll come back and execute everything that's inside the dialog. So it's a way of encapsulating sort of a bunch of logic together into something that can be repeated. So you see there we've got a begin dialog option now inside the dialog that we've named. We've called it get a Chuck Norris fact. That's sort of the Microsoft bot framework recommended way of naming things. So to start off with, all we're going to do is fetch an external resource. First of all, we're going to send a response just saying that we're fetching the fact to let the user know that we're doing something. And then we're going to send an HTTP request off. It's going to be a get method, and the URL is just going to be to the Chuck Norris joke random API. If we scroll down a bit in the HTTP request options, you'll see that there's a bit of an option for where we store the result into. So we're going to save that into the dialog properties, and we're just going to call that API response. There's some options for the type of response, so you can parse it as different things. By default it expects a JSON response. Okay, so then we are going to that's right. So it's gone to fetch the joke from the Chuck Norris API. It's stored that into a response. Obviously, to display that back to the user, we have to put that inside an actual response that we send back from the bot. So here we're going to put the dialog.api response value that we've stored in the previous step, and we're going to get the content of that, which is the actual JSON itself, and then the key for the property that we want is just called value, so we're going to use that. So let's give that a try in the emulator. We're going to type in chuck, and it's going to go off and fetch a fact for us, and then this is the value that it's got back from the API endpoint. So we can try another one if we type chuck again, and it's going to go off and do the same thing each time. So if we switch back to Bot Framework Composer again, what we can do is kind of flesh this out a little bit more and make it a bit more, give it a bit more personality by pasting in some options for the language generation for what it initially says, and the way that it formats the response that it sends back to the user by pasting in a bunch of different options for how it formats that response. Restart the bot and go back to the emulator and try a few options, and you'll see that it's again using a different bit of text each time. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is ask a question to get some input from the user after they've got the fact, to ask them if they want to get another fact without having to type the trigger word again each time. So we're going to go to ask a question, and we're going to choose a confirmation type of question. So that's a yes/no question. So it's similar to, say, in JavaScript, like a confirmation dialog where you've got the yes or no buttons to respond. So you get to paste in some text that you want the bot to send to ask the question, and then in this next part of that we get to provide some options for the user input. So we get a property that we want to store the value into, and then the way that the question is formatted, we have some options for that, and we're just going to choose a list to start off with, so that will provide the options that we choose just in a simple yes/no list, and we're going to provide the actual choices that we want just as yes, no, and we're going to type say Norris for no, just to show that you can format the way that the choices are displayed without affecting the way that it interprets the logic. And so the choice options, that's for if you've got multiple options, you can choose how it formats those options, and if you choose a different type of list style. And the other thing we want to do is come down and choose always prompt, set that to true, so that it will always ask the question each time we come through the loop. Otherwise, by default, it stores the information, and so it won't ask it each time because it's already got that information saved, and that would be saved until the bot was restarted, or the way that it stores the information is when it's running sort of locally, it's just storing it in a memory, straight into memory, but the bot framework has options for extending that when you're running it as an actual bot in production. You can provide places that it will go off and store that, so some sort of key value store, like Redis or something like that. So then we want to check what the user's responded with, and if it's true, so we create a branch. If it's true, then we want to repeat the dialog, so that's going back to the start again, and if it's false, we're just going to send some information and then end the dialog. So let's give that a try and see how it works in the emulator. it's going to go off and get us a fact, and then this time at the end it's going to come back with the prompt to say, do you want more, yes or no? We type in yes, and it's going to go through the loop again. So this time we don't have to type chuck each time. It'll just sit there in a loop until we exit out of it with an affirmative response. Interestingly, you don't have to type the exact value it's expecting for yes. It's quite clever. It'll do things like take a Y, it'll work with lowercase text, it'll even work with colloquialisms like yeah, and for no, it'll cope with things like nope. So that's pretty cool. That's all just built into it. So that's all working pretty well. What we're going to do next is come down and change the way that it sends those values back to an inline list instead, and see how it looks when you format it differently. Come back into the bot again and fire that off, and then this time, instead of the options being listed as sort of bullet points, it'll just be an inline piece of text. So you can see the difference there between the two ways of formatting that. And so then we're going to see how that works in Symphony. So back over in Symphony, we're going to fire off the chuck trigger, and it should come back and give us a joke, and again we can respond with yes, using yes, yep, yeah, anything along those lines, until we've had enough of it, and then we can cancel out with no. Okay, so that's all working pretty well. So then the next thing we're going to do is sort of build off of what we've got here and build a simple weather bot that'll actually take some user input. So currently with the Chuck Norris one, it's not actually using any information that we provide. So what we're going to do is create a weather bot. Again, we're going to call this weather trigger, and the pattern we're going to look for is just the text weather, and so then again we're going to create a new dialogue so that we can loop over it the same way that we did for the previous one. So create the new dialogue. You can see there that it's got a list of the previous ones, so you can reuse dialogues from multiple triggers if you want to. And so then, rather than us going and rebuilding all of that logic that we've already used in the Chuck Norris bot to get us started, what we're going to do is copy what we've got. You can see there's some options up the top there. We're going to choose copy. Come over here, and this time when we click the plus button, it gives us an option to paste what we've got on the clipboard, so we can paste all of those options in. So that's a good way of duplicating similar functionality across the bot quite quickly. So we're going to change the language generation options to ask for a city. And then obviously we need to store that information that we get. So actually, rather than just sending a response, we're going to ask a question instead, and it's just going to be a piece of text that it expects to get back. So we can paste that text back in there, and we'll delete that send a response option. And so then, because we've asked a question, we need to save the response into a property. So we're just going to call that dialogue.city. And again, we're going to always prompt the user so that it asks them again each time that we come through. So once we've got that and we're storing the input that the user provides into a property, again we're going to go off and send an HTTP request. This time we're going to use the OpenWeatherMap API. So you can sign up for that and get an API key for free. And so here you can see in the URL we're just providing the city directly into the query string there, and it'll be interpolated. So it's the same sort of format as a JavaScript string interpolation property. And we save the response that we get again into dialog.api response. This time so we can see what's going on, because the response that we get back is a little bit more complicated than the Chuck Norris API. We're going to dump the API response content property into a trace output, and that allows you to see it directly in the bot framework emulator, which is quite useful. So then once we've done that, we need to check the response. We didn't do this for the Chuck Norris one, we probably should have, but we're going to do it here with the bot to check that it was actually a valid response that we got back and not an error code. So you can see in the response properties that you get back, there's a status code property, so we're just going to check that it's a 200. And then if so, we're going to branch off of there, and we're going to just copy our content up into a weather property, just to make it a bit easier to work with when we're formatting the output. So we're going to say dialog.weather equals our dialog.api response.content property, and then we're going to send that information back to the user by interpolating this dialog.weather property, which has a bunch of other properties underneath it for things like the city, the country that we're in, temperature, and the description of the weather. So we're going to say the weather in the city that we requested in whatever country code is the type of description, and then the temperature in degrees centigrade. So originally, for some reason, the weather sends it back, the API sends it back to you by default in Kelvin, which is a bit confusing. So you can choose on the API option whether you want to use metric or other sorts of units. So if you're in America, you could get Fahrenheit responses if you wanted. So then if we got an error code back, so anything other than a 200, we're just going to say I got an error and give the content of the error message back to the user. So then we are going to delete that previous option that we had there, and asks, this time we're going to ask, would you like to check another city? So again, we're going to loop through the dialog, but it'll allow the user to check the weather in another city if they wish to. And then the core of that logic can stay there. We're just going to add some extra language generation in there to say, okay, let's go again. And then obviously change the response if they choose no, and give them some information about how they can try again by typing weather. Okay, so I think that's looking pretty good to go there. We're just going to change the confirm choices to no instead of Norris, because it doesn't make sense for the weather, obviously. So let's give that a try in the emulator. We're going to type weather, and this time it's going to ask us a prompt for which city do we want to check the weather for. We're going to go for London, and at the time of recording this, the weather was, oh, we got an error. So it's saying, okay, there was an invalid API key. So if we go back to the composer, we can just show there that the trace option that we put into the code is dumping out the value of the API response there. So just can be useful for extra debugging options. But we're going to go back in and scroll back up to our HTTP request, and I've just realized I actually forgot to include the API key on there, so I'm going to quickly paste that in and restart the bot and give it another go. So let's try that again, and London once more. Okay, great. So it's come back with the weather in London is broken clouds and the temperature is 16 degrees. And it's prompting us again. Oh yeah, so in the trace information we can see the actual, all of the properties that were provided in that response. So we could use that to format the information to include things like the wind speed and if there's some icons that it provides that you can use to go off and fetch some richer type of response. So let's try that over in Symphony again. And so again we're going to choose London. Should come back with roughly the same information. We're going to choose to check another city this time, and we're going to go check where I used to live back in New Zealand, in Wellington. So a little bit colder back over there at the moment, and then we're going to check. So I thought it had asked me to provide a city, but it was asking for yes or no, so you can see it interpreted that as a no response. So I run through it again. This time it thinks Croydon is in the US, so we're going to try again, and this time we're going to just the way that the weather API expects a country is to include it after a comma. So this time it's got it right, Croydon, Great Britain. A few clouds and the temperature is 15.6 degrees. So there you go. We've got 3 simple little bots running in about 20 minutes using Bot Framework Composer, and we can test them in the emulator first and get sort of debug information in there, and then they run in Symphony. So just to follow on from that, with the yes/no options that we're providing in the confirmation, some of the other options that you can use in the list style, if you go to the learn more information, it just has like a built-in version of the help website there. You can see that there's a few different ways of formatting the appearance of the confirmation. So we've been using inline, we used list to start off with, and you can see suggested action actually gives you a list of buttons that you can click on. So we're going to change that to suggested action and restart it and see how that looks inside of the emulator. So we're going to start our chuck bot again, and this time when it gives us the yes/no options are actually going to be buttons that we can click on if we wanted to do that. So if we click on yes, then that basically simulates the user typing that option in and sends it straight back to the bot. So again we can click yes a few more times until we've had enough Chuck Norris facts, and then we can of course click no to cancel out of that. So that's all working pretty good inside of the emulator, but how's that going to work in Symphony? Obviously it would be nice if we could do the same thing in Symphony and have it provide buttons for us to click on. Now that we've got elements available, then yeah, we can do that. So this shows how we can map those suggested actions into elements options. So you'll see there we get the same buttons, this time using elements buttons. So if we click on yes, then it's going to send that response back to the bot, and again the bot goes through the loop. Interestingly, we can still type in the response if we want. We don't have to use the buttons. So if we just type yes again, then it's going to still work in exactly the same way. So it's good that it kind of gives you the option of using the buttons if you want to, but it can still handle the user providing input via the keyboard as well. Okay, so that's the end of it in Symphony. What we're going to do now is see how it works inside of Microsoft Teams. So it's going to be the exact same bot code. The only slight difference we have to make is there's currently a bug in the custom channel code that I've written where it's failing authentication for Teams responses with the middleware in place. So I'm just going to remove the middleware from the startup file and restart the bot, and then run it up in Teams. So we haven't changed anything inside of Bot Framework Composer at all. It's still the same composer file. It's just a little change to the bot code itself. So if we wait for that to run up again and then switch back over to Teams this time, we'll see how it works inside of Teams. It's just taking a little while to rebuild. Okay, so let's switch over to Teams. So here's our bot in a one-to-one chat, and I've previously registered the commands, the triggers. When you create your bot inside of Teams, you've got the option of registering commands that it can handle. So we've put those in already, echo, chuck, and weather. So it kind of gives you an autocomplete if you start typing. And it matches one of those commands. You can use it as a shortcut. So wait for it to send the information through. So this is working, the bot's running locally, but Teams obviously is hosted in the cloud, so it's using ngrok endpoint to tunnel back out of the internet through to my local machine. So there, the Echo bot's working fine. So we switched over to the weather option. Again, it's working fine for London. Try Wellington again. Still cold in Wellington. And then let's try the chuck one last. Okay, and so this is interesting. The suggested actions aren't working inside of Teams, which is a bit weird because Teams is quite closely aligned to how the output in the emulator usually appears. So there's a GitHub issue that I found around this, where they haven't mapped suggested action to an option for how it would work in Teams. So interestingly, if you choose none, apparently the bot framework composer decides which one it should use based on the calling input. So it kind of picks up that it's Teams and it uses a hero card by default. Inside of Symphony, if you choose none, it'll just appear as a list. But in this case, we're just going to choose hero card because we know that we're running against Teams now, just to show you how it works in Teams. So the response looks pretty much the same as Symphony. You get two buttons that you can click on. Just wait for the response to come back, and so then you can click on those buttons. So similar to how the elements work inside of Symphony. Okay, so that's pretty much it. If you're interested in finding out more, I'll put some links in the show notes for things to go and check out. I hope you found it useful. And yeah, you might want to consider using it for your own bot projects. It's a pretty good tool.